Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Explore Spiritism program on Kardec Radio. If you watched the announcement video in which I talked about this new program that Kardec Radio is going to begin broadcasting, you may remember that I mentioned some episodes of this program would involve commentary and reflections. Others might focus on a particular Spiritist text, and yet others would be more like a drill down or look at some of the fundamentals of Spiritist teachings. And this episode is one of the latter. I wanted to do something right away about spirits and the concept of spirits according to Spiritist teachings, because they're really essential to following most everything that we will discuss from one Explore Spiritism program to another, and really key to anyone's study or an exploration of Spiritism. I know that many, if not most of the Kardec Radio listeners and those who watch its programs are familiar with this, but the truth is that we have people coming new to Spiritism all the time. And if that's you, if you're someone in the beginning stages of exploring Spiritism, then this is for you. I'm here for you tonight. However, for those who are familiar already with Spiritism, if you enjoy finding resources that can help others to get started, this program is also for you. Now, if you're one of those new to the idea of spirits or to the Spiritist definition and understanding of spirits, I can relate. I've been there. I was an adult when I was first introduced to Spiritism. Until then, I'd heard of, the immortal, everlasting soul and the religious notion. We talk about ghosts or haunted houses. I attributed that, I guess, to fantasy. You hear terms like evil spirits that seem to me like folklore, or ancestral spirits that I guess I attributed to cultural traditions. I never heard of good spirits, except maybe Casper the Ghost, who I recalled from my childhood. But never spirits with the depth and scope of meaning that we use the term in Spiritism. And what's curious to me is that I grew up less than 40 miles away from the very small, tiny little hamlet of Hydesville, New York, considered the birthplace of modern spiritualism. And in general, in upstate New York, an area rich in the 19th century spiritualist activity in the US and the history of all that, but I never heard about that growing up. And nowadays, there is an increasingly easier and much more widely available access to information about spirits and related subjects. Awareness is growing, and the depth of that information is also becoming wider and more accessible. But there's also a lot of misinformation out there that may have people confused, misinformed. Combine that with the negative connotations of some of those terms that I mentioned earlier, or even skepticism when it comes to some of the religious notions. And I think that's why we find people a little sheepish at first, sometimes, when it comes to the terms spirit or Spiritism. But as we find in and through Spiritism, there's really no need for that. And well, if you are watching this video, then you probably have at least an open mind to hear some things I have to say and what Spiritism has to teach. So that's excellent. And what I want to do now is give you some basic notions to get you started on the right track and make clear some important concepts that represent building blocks of Spiritist thought and studies. So first, spirits are not beings apart from us. They're not some distinct population. It's not us and them, or us and the spirits. The entities that we refer to as spirits of the dead or spirits of the invisible world, ghosts, etc., are simply souls like ourselves who once had physical bodies with the flesh, the bones, the physical organs, and all of that, as we do now, and who are at the time of reference free from this earthly flesh. They're like us, and we're like them. Or better, they are us, and we are them. The only difference is the embodiment or not at a given point in time within a material body and all that that entails, from the moment of physical birth, or really conception, to the time of physical death. So much so that our mental and emotional states, our affections and disaffections toward others, our intellectual and moral acquisitions, and everything else belonging to the soul are not lost at the moment of physical death and when the material body is left behind. And we'll talk a little more about that in a bit, but before we get there, I wanted to give that some foundation by explaining a few important concepts key to what I've already mentioned and what we have yet to explore. And by the way, they're concepts key to pretty much everything that is studied and discussed in Spiritism. So according to Spiritism, and if you give me a moment, second here, I want to share something on my screen. According to Spiritism, in the universe created by God, God being the supreme intelligence, first cause of all things, we have two primary basic elements, spirit and matter. Matter is simply everything in some way material, but that exists on a kind of gradient or spectrum because we find it in perhaps limitless forms or varieties of modified forms. So on one end of that spectrum, we find matter that is highly ponderable, the most dense. This is matter as we know it. This is the matter that we can touch and feel, and the matter that's most typically studied by our traditional sciences. On the other end of that spectrum, we have matter in its most ethereal forms that are least ponderable, least tangible. They're closest to matter's most primitive state. Just as a rough analogy, imagine water, for example, representing matter. You can have water that's rock hard solid. You can have water that's in the liquid state, and yet water that evaporates. So you see like humidity that's in the air, sort of like a gas, right? You have humidity that we can't see, but yet it's there, okay? That's just an analogy, but it shows how we have all the different forms of matter. Now, the second basic universal element, we call it immaterial or non-material simply because it in no way represents or resembles physical matter as we know it. This is spirit, or what we call the intelligent principle of the universe. Most of the time, though, when we use the term spirit in Spiritism, we're referring to individual living spirits who are the individualized forms of the intelligent principle. So that's us as human spirits. But let's take a deeper look. Let's look one level deeper into this knowledge that will actually go a long way in helping you follow Spiritist science and philosophy, okay? So in a basic definition, we see matter on its spectrum. And we have, in terms of us as spirits, you can look at this picture, this image here to help. We have the soul itself, the thinking, intelligent soul, the individualized form of that intelligent principle. But this soul itself has a semi-material body that gives it, in part, its shape. Remember before I talked about the matter existing on this kind of spectrum. So this spiritual body that we call the perispirit, we say that it is semi-material, somewhere not in the most dense and not in the most ethereal forms of matter. When we talk about an aura or seeing or registering someone's aura or some aspect of it, it is the perispirit that is related to. Or when we talk about energetic therapies, like the passes at the Spiritist Center, or Reiki, or some other therapy involving our energetic body, this involves the perispirit. And just the same, when certain individuals are able to see a spirit, it is the perispirit or the spiritual body that is giving the shape and appearance that that person is able to see. Now, sometimes we have a physical material body, sometimes we don't. Okay, we always have the perispirit, but not always the physical material body. That's where we get the term incarnation. When we are incarnated is when we have the physical body. And during that time, this perispirit acts as an intermediary between the material body and the soul. In other words, it's like a go-between, linking the two and allowing them to act upon one another. Our union of the soul and perispirit with the physical body is a process that starts with conception, and our permanent separation, again, from the physical body is also a process that happens through what we call death. But in reality, death is something that only the material body undergoes, not the soul, not the spirit. We're immortal. Stepping back, once our individualized immortal souls come into existence, we don't immediately think and act as we do today. In reality, we begin this human existence in what Spiritism refers to as a state of simplicity and unawareness, meaning that from there, we've got a whole lot of learning to do. It's our time to grow intellectually and morally speaking. In other words, to develop the mind and the heart, knowledge and sentiment. So we retain from the moment of our creation our individuality, and therefore we can continue to progress, never regress, never assuming less evolved life forms, but always building on what we had previously acquired. The spiritual development of the evolving human soul is a process that takes millennia. And it involves a great multitude of lifetimes spent in the material realm. What do I mean by material realm? Well, going back again to the concept of matter existing on a spectrum from most dense to most ethereal, then the material realm, like our Earth, is made up of matter most ponderable, most dense. This is the matter, as I said, that we know now, including our physical bodies and everything that we see around us. But alongside it, in another dimension, if you will, yet coexisting along with our material world, is the spiritual realm, which is simply made up of matter in a more ethereal state relative to our material world. Reason why it's usually undetectable to us as incarnates. And as for the spirits who inhabit this realm, we call them discarnate spirits. They're just the ones who, at the time of reference, don't have this physical body. This is the state we find ourselves in between our material incarnations. So no, death does not exist. There is life after death, which also becomes this period, again, of life before birth or rebirth. But there's so much more to it, because in that time between incarnations, which, by the way, can last a really long time sometimes, we don't float around or simply exist in some dormant state of unconsciousness, nor do we just wait it out, conscious but quarantined, right, in some kind of waiting room. Our souls, we don't just remain alive after physical death, we go on living, actively living. So the whole process of reincarnation, or the series of material lives in the material world, with time spent in the spirit realm in between, or in that discarnate state between the physical lives, is a topic, really a multitude of topics in and of itself. What I wanted to get to yet tonight is what spirits in the discarnate state are like, and also what their world or the spirit realm is like. We know what incarnate humans and the incarnate life is like, or better, we know or remember something about it because we're living it, at least one lifetime's experience right now. What we don't have at the forefront of our consciousness is, for most of us at all, what the discarnate state is like. So let's start with what discarnate spirits are like, okay? And I hope not to disappoint you here, but we don't have time for the long answer on that. And the short answer is that those spirits are like us. Remember when I said that they are us and we are them? When someone departs from the physical world or incarnate state, his or her soul simply loses the physical body. What we think, as well as our attitudes, our opinions, what we value most, how we feel, the emotions that we have, who we love, and who we don't so much love. None of that changes simply because we left the physical body. In a similar way, our moral disposition also remains the same. So we have the same virtues that we've acquired until then, and the vices that we've acquired but not yet overcome. And our knowledge is the same at the spiritual level, meaning in readapting to the discarnate state, we may recall some memories and knowledge that the material body and all the material influences of our most recent incarnation kept momentarily from access by our mental faculties, always for a purpose related to our incarnatory goals for that last life. But we still have only the knowledge that our spirits had acquired, at least at some point until then. So this is why we say about spirits that just because they're discarnate, just because someone is on the other side, doesn't mean that they know everything or that they are inherently good. For these reasons, if we have an opportunity to communicate with them, and yes, this communication exists, it doesn't mean that we should necessarily just ask any spirit for answers or advice. No more than we'd walk up to any random person on the street and ask for the same. We first want to know what? Their character? and how much they actually know about the subject that we want to ask about. It's also important to make it clear that spirits are not created at the same time. And given that, and the fact that we progress at different rates according to our use of free will, you can see how the nature and knowledge of discarnate beings that we may come in contact with are just as, if not more varied, than the incarnate beings that we live amongst. After all, in the spirit world and other material worlds throughout creation, we find souls both more primitive and far more advanced than those that we interact with here on Earth. It's just the reality of spirit life. What about our loved ones? Do they remember us? Do they miss us? Of course they do. The bonds of love and affection do not go away. So they miss us, they think of us, and actually they feel the impact of our energy when we are thinking of them, and the energies that embody our thoughts when we pray for them or talk to them in thought and prayer. And our prayers actually help us to remain in contact and communicate to them until we can be with them again in a way that feels more familiar to us. On that note, what about our enemies? Do they remember us? Yeah, they remember us too. All the more reason to be vigilant and careful when it comes to the kind of spiritual influences that we will attract. So if discarnate spirits are like us, what is their life like in the spirit realm? What is our life like when we are in the spirit realm or in the discarnate state? Well, like the material world has all kinds of environments, so too does the spirit realm. And these environments can range from unpleasant to wonderful. Okay, in reality, they can go from downright horrific to blissful. What determines where we find ourselves upon parting from material life is the kind of life that we lived and our mental and emotional condition at that time. This is also a topic that can get very detailed, and there's lots to study. But what I want you to be aware of is that existence in the spiritual realm is not an inert state. We're able to act and interact with other discarnate beings, and we do. And in some ways, discarnate beings can also interact with us as incarnate spirits. There are environments in the spirit realm where life is surprisingly familiar, where spirits have homes, institutions, governing bodies, occupations, schools, hospitals for the body, spiritual body, and soul. There's places of worship and much more. It is the blissful worlds that are yet unfamiliar to us as evolving spirits, even if we could recall right now our entire spiritual past. But we can at least read about them to some degree in Spiritist texts. Of course, there's much yet that we truly have still to discover, as right now we don't even have the vocabulary or conceptual framework to learn about. But it is the blissful worlds that we strive to attain with our efforts to progress along our path of spiritual development. A last point that I want to touch on tonight. Yes, as I mentioned before, discarnate spirits do communicate with incarnate spirits. In fact, our two realms are in a constant state of interaction and exchange. In many ways, this happens all the time without us even being aware of it. But through the faculty of mediumship, there are individuals who have the ability to either perceive spirits, receive communications from them, communicate with them, or facilitate some kind of spirit manifestation, because there are many forms of mediumship. And this is a topic we could go on about for days, not really for the scope tonight. But the important thing is that we, incarnate and discarnate spirits, are not two populations distinct from one another, and we do live in a constant state of exchange and interaction with one another. In Spiritism, we study a lot more about this. And in Spiritism, mediumship is employed for many forms of service and benefit of beings in both realms of life. As you can see, we touched on a lot tonight that can be explored a whole lot more. Imagine the Spiritist body of knowledge like a tree. Tonight, we put together some of the trunk. There are many details behind all this and history, deeper into the roots. And there are branches and branches of information and knowledge that expand on the brief presentation of ideas that we had time for tonight. But what we did look at is important for just about any other discussion that we will have going forward. For those eager to explore this more, before I close, I would like to point out two resources for doing just that. And again, I'm going to share my screen here. Second. Okay. One is the Explore Spiritism website, explorespiritism.com, where in this section, Spiritism in Depth, you can find more of what we've talked about tonight. So in this portion here, okay, you can look at those basic elements of the universe, spirit and matter, and even more detail. We talked from what I presented here and we talked about tonight. Likewise, in this other section here, you can look at or read more about spirits themselves, the spirit realm, attributes of the spirits, more about what they're like, and a whole lot more. You can even start to read more about reincarnation, okay? There's a whole lot here available to you in the explorespiritism.com website that you can look at your leisure and dive deeper into the topics that interest you most. Another resource is a talk that I gave that, happens to be recorded and is available online, called Where Do We Come From? And in this talk, I'm going to switch tabs here because in this image I have some slides from that talk where a little bit of that image on the slide may look familiar because I took it from this presentation, the slides from the talk. I go deeper in this talk into a lot of what we've talked about tonight. So you might want to check out that talk, and I will put the links for both this presentation and Explore Spiritism website in the comment section of this video for you, okay? And stop sharing here again tonight. Just to close, remember, if you didn't get to watch this presentation from the beginning, you can always go back and watch the recording from the start. Anywhere that Kardec Radio can be seen, including Kardec Radio's Facebook page. I'll also share it on Explore Spiritism. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them here or send them to Kardec Radio. Thanks again, everyone, for watching. Have a great 2 weeks. Good night. and God bless.